What do you think the greatest challenge to the challenge of nonviolence in Syria is currently?
The greatest challenge to nonviolence, I think, has always been that the regime is willing to use any and all forms of violence. There are no moral or ethical boundaries for the Assad regime. It's not enough to fire lead bullets. It's not enough to randomly and arbitrarily detain activists. It's not enough to torture them in prison. It's not enough to use chemical weapons and barrel bombs. So there are no limits to the extent of violence the regime will take. And they've proven that over the past 10 years. And so the biggest challenge is working with activists who face incredibly difficult security concerns, whose very survival is in question, and convincing them that nonviolence will eventually lead to change. And sometimes it's very difficult to make the argument, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think so too. When you're thinking about people who are fighting for the side of good, you know, you're constrained by like a moral compass. And when you're fighting against a regime or individuals who don't have one, or just playing by
correct
rules, it's hard to stay true to those things, I can imagine.
Right. And so that really does speak to Syrian resilience, because, you know, you won't hear in the media and you won't read in the headlines that there are still nonviolent acts, there is still civil resistance. You won't ever see that in the news, but the fact that it exists, it is such a testament to the Syrian character and Syrian strength.
What do you think can be learned from both the successes and the failures of combating violent corruption with nonviolent tactics?
I think Syria has so many lessons to share with other activist movements, from tactics in escaping a violent, murderous regime to ways of raising community awareness or sort of advocating for a cause. I think Syria probably represents one of the most violent revolutions in modern history. And so I think there are a lot of lessons that Syrians can share. I think as we see more and more activist movements around the world, there's always a common thread, right? Activists are generally pissed off, right? You don't spur yourself to action unless you're pissed off about something. I would say that just about every activist movement is about bringing about change and pressuring governments to change. And so there's that common thread of the desire for positive change. Most often we see it around human rights, equal rights. We see this in the United States. We see it in France. We see it all over Europe. We see it in Asia. And so I think what Syria represents, in a sense, is this common humanity. And we're also a showcase for, look what can happen when the international community fails to take action.
It's such an inspiration, I think, to young activists and, you know, honestly, not just young, of all ages all over the world, to see the resilience the Syrian people have maintained through this. It's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
What do you wish that you could impart onto people who maybe are unsure where to even begin getting involved in this kind of work or activism?
If they're unsure, I think they need to ask themselves why they're unsure. If they are afraid of retaliation by the regime, they're absolutely right to be, right? The regime does retaliate, and it doesn't just retaliate in Syria, it goes internationally. I think what people have to ask themselves is, does their moral compass permit them to watch as this happens? Do they feel at all compelled to stand up for the case of human rights? And in human rights, of course, I'm including women's rights. Are they prepared to sit back and watch? Or do they want to be part of a change that can only benefit not just Syria, but the whole region? I think those would be the two starting points. And I would say, even if people are afraid to get involved, sort of out in the open, there are so many initiatives taking place. They can get involved silently or sort of behind the scenes. They don't need to be prominent, but they do need to care, and they do need to do something.
There's been so much international involvement in the region. What's your sentiment about feeling like people who are not Syrian, of Syrian descent, feeling like this is not something they should be paying attention to or necessarily their problem?
Well, I think people around the world should be paying attention to this, and it is their problem, because this is a problem of humanity. And so I think it's global. The movement is global. The desires are the same if you're in Hong Kong or Belarus or now Nigeria, right? Or if you're an African American in the United States, in what has become a police state. So the struggle itself, I think, is universal. But when we see political actors making decisions for Syrians, then I think most Syrians feel like they're just pawns in a bunch of different proxy wars. And of course, there's very deep resentment, because, many of us feel that had it not been for Russian and Iranian and Hezbollah support, the Syrian people would have managed to overthrow their regime and start instituting a democratic state.
A hope of ours with this series is to launch a series of conversations about these, really controversial or difficult topics. So, what good do you think could come from having these kinds of conversations?
Well, I think it's important to expose uncomfortable truths. It's important to look reality in the face. It's important, I think, to have the courage to say what nobody wants to hear. And, at the end of the day, each one of us is here for a very brief period, right? I think we have to try to make the world a better place for future generations, if not in our lifetimes, but then at least in the lifetimes of others. What good comes from it? I think we educate. I think we share perspectives. I think we show diversity of opinion and diversity of approach. There may not be any single right answer, but we'll never know that if we don't share our perspectives. And I think at the end of the day, when we have uncomfortable conversations, rather than becoming combative, I think what we do is expose our shared humanity. And I think that's so missing in a lot of conversations today. So these kinds of discussions are important to bring us back to what matters.
Yeah, I can agree more. I think the storytelling aspect and being able to shine light on people who may have had their voice taken from them is incredibly important. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. Last question I have for you. And this is just kind of a philosophical one, but what would a world of nonviolence look like to you?
That's a big question. Yeah. I think a world of nonviolence really means diplomacy, collaboration, cooperation, mutual respect, an understanding, again, of our shared humanity, an understanding that the purpose of war is to kill. And while I'm not by any stretch of the imagination a religious person, thou shalt not kill, to me, is a fundamental principle that we need to abide by. I think nonviolence means paving the way for positive change without harming others. And I that may be very general. I got to think about this a little bit. But I unfortunately don't really see a world without violence, because I think that's how governments are set up. Hopefully, as women become more prominent leaders in the world, then they will become more peacemakers rather than war makers. And I think maybe then we can start to see a shift towards nonviolence being manifested in leadership.
It's interesting, I think, bringing the women into the conversation as you're seeing so many more women getting into positions of political authority and this push of solution building instead of just
that's right.
The same thing you've always been throwing at it, is fight fire with fire instead of diplomacy and negotiation and healing.
Right, absolutely.
All right, this was incredible. I was so excited.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
If you think these conversations are important and you'd like to see them continue, please consider supporting Nonviolence International and the work that we do by subscribing to this channel, following us on Twitter and on Facebook. Also, please consider making a donation to our organization. Every little bit adds up and helps us build a global culture of nonviolence. Thank you so much for watching, and please keep an ear out for our next video.